All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of what I think has been already a fantastic conference, and it's going to get only better. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our second keynote speaker, Jonathan Haskel from the Imperial College Business School. Now, while Jonathan probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, especially in this crowd, I'll do it anyway because it's really quite impressive. So, as many of you would know, Jonathan's research is centered around essentially anything and everything that has to do with productivity growth. If you go through his very long list of publications, you will see almost literally every single determinant or effect of productivity growth. So I'll just give you a little taster of some of the words that you would see in the published papers. Intangibles, public and private, AI, telecommunications industry, network effects, spillovers, big data, but also cross-country convergence, foreign direct investment, copyrights, design services, intellectual property, competition, market structure, entry, exit, exporting, privatization, skilled and unskilled employment, inequality, and a bunch of more. So it probably doesn't come as a surprise that Jonathan, aside from his many other accolades, has received a prestigious prize, the Indigo Prize, which is meant to kind of celebrate new and creative ways of thinking of how to measure the modern economy. Now, aside from his academic contributions, Jonathan has also served on many important committees. Again, I'll just tell you about a few. I think Jonathan just finished his second term in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, but he's also served on the as a member of committees on the Competition and Markets Authority, the Financial Regulator and Payments Regulator authorities. And in these capacities, he's contributed a lot to the public debate in various areas, inquiries into mobile phones, airports, mergers. And from Kevin, I know that that Jonathan is effectively credited for saving UK science during planned big budget cuts in the early 2010s. So all the UK members of universities have to say thank you to Jonathan today. Now, we're very pleased to have Jonathan speak about innovation to us, but I have one more thing that I'd be very curious to hear about. As one of Jonathan's publications published in 2021, a numerical study of vibration-induced instrument reading capability degradation in helicopter pilots, published in the Aeronautical Journal. But maybe we'll save that for the coffee break. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that very kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for inviting me, to Kevin for organising this, and to Rebecca and ESCoE and all the terrific team who've been doing all this, and to Owen as well for all of his support. I got here on Sunday because I was teaching all day on Friday. Now that I'm away from the Bank of England, I'm back at Imperial College. Imperial College is in South Kensington. I then flew 10,000 miles in order to end up in Kensington. So many thanks to Kevin and the UNSW community for considerately naming this bit for us in Britain, imitating Australia and having Kensington, so I didn't get confused about where I was. Okay, so on the productivity side, so here's a graph from the OECD of GDP per hour. This will be familiar to people. I'm mostly going to be talking about the US and the UK and the EU, so apologies to the Australian audience. I'll try and point out the parallels, and in the Q&A, I'd love to hear about whether any of this resonates with the Australian side as well. 4 different phases. Pre-GFC, we had relatively high productivity. This is GDP per hour. Post-GFC, then we had a big slowdown. We had a particularly peculiar set of circumstances in the pandemic, which I'll talk about, especially from a policy point of view. I was working at the Bank of England, well, up until 6 weeks ago, so I worked over the pandemic as well. And then, of course, there's a question about the post-pandemic. So there are lots of different questions on the table. Why the difference performance over these years? What links are there to other changes we think we've seen in the economy? So I mentioned the OECD. Chiara Cuscolo and colleagues at the OECD have done this very influential work about the notion that leading firms are pulling away from laggards. Lots of work on markups, which I'm not very fond of, so I'll say a word about that in a while. Macro policy, again with my Bank of England hat on, how does all of this tie up with macro policy? And something about the future, big changes, working from home, very important in Europe and America, and talking to Australian friends here, obviously important here. And then AI, you can't go to a seminar, at least in the UK, without mentioning AI about every 15 minutes. The core of our work on intangibles, let me try to summarize it in the following way. So if you're not familiar with the intangibles sort of school of thought, let me try to persuade you that it's important. And it's important because we think business has changed. Here's what factories used to look like, and here's what factories look like now. This is the Microsoft team in Albuquerque when they first started in the 1970s. This is Bill Gates down here, very young looking Bill Gates, and that's Paul Allen over there. And what's changed about it can be seen if we look at the world's top 5 companies, just as an example. So this is from the PwC. They do an annual review of the top 5 companies. Everybody will surely recognize these companies: Apple, Microsoft, Saudi Aramco, maybe a little bit less familiar. That's the state-owned oil and gas company in Saudi Arabia. Alphabet is, of course, Google and Amazon. And again, if we just sort of think about what it is that's different about these companies, if we start with Saudi Aramco, here's a picture of Saudi Aramco's assets, very tangible types of assets: buildings, equipment, vehicles, ships, pipes, stuff like that. Here's a picture of Microsoft's assets. This is Word 3, I think. So this is from 1986. And these are the first few lines of code from the dictionary, add-in to Microsoft Word. And so you see the idea again to an economics audience like this, a measurement audience like this, in particular, this should be familiar. The assets of Saudi Aramco and previously dominant companies were very tangible. The assets of Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon are very intangible. And so we think then that this is an important change in the structure of the economy, which should be reflected then in policy and, of course, in measurement. Carol Corrado and my colleagues we have a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives which tries to sort of set all this out from a couple of years ago. And here's a picture we tried to put together. Those of you who know the Journal of Economic Perspectives will know they don't like equations. They want kind of pictures and a story. So let me sort of say something about this. What we have in mind, and this is Corrado, Holton, and Sickle, is an upstream and a downstream structure of production. The upstream production is of intangible assets. The downstream production is of final products. What happens upstream, workers and capital is combined together with knowledge to produce new commercially valuable knowledge. That then feeds into the downstream. What do the downstream production sector, consumption sector do? They produce consumer goods from worker hours, from tangible capital, payments of commercially valuable knowledge, and that produces output in goods and services. And then, of course, there's freely available commercially useful knowledge, which is kind of hanging around in the wind as well. And that's the sort of notion of spillovers and so forth. I do want to stress 2 things. One is, it's not necessary that that we're talking about separate firms here. It could perfectly well be that this is all within a particular firm. So the upstream and downstream are just, as it were, the research division and the production division of the firm. That's one thing. The second thing is, when we talk about knowledge, I think this intangibles research program is best understood in terms of commercially valuable knowledge, right? So there's obviously heaps of knowledge out there, in the world, but commercializing that knowledge, I think, is a major challenge for firms. And what we're, I think, trying to study here is the steps that firms are taking to commercialize that and thereby embody it in production. So that gives an expanded view of capital, and just quickly on this. So the conventional view of production function would be labor services and tangible capital services and some kind of Hicksian shifter. And that gives you a value added equation, which is going to be in nominals, consumption and investment, which of course will add up to payments to labor, payments to capital. If one expands capital, and this is Corrado, Holton, and Sickle, what does one get? One gets a different form of output. I'm going to call that Q, which is the Hicksian shifter, and then labor capital and R, the stock of intangible capital. Q is expanded value added, and then, as I say here, labor, tangible and intangible. And then, so what are the flows that need to balance out? There's expanded amounts of value added because there's more investment going around. That is to say, the production of these new intangible capital, new formulae for ideas, new business processes. And then there are payments on the payment side. How is that balanced? There are payments to this intangible capital as well. And so getting a sense of how the economy looks differently in that way is what it is that we are trying to do. And that'll be important when we look at, for example, trends in profitability when one does and does not measure intangible capital. Now, we had a bit of a discussion yesterday, and Paul, where is Paul? Paul is over there. Paul raised the issue about what company accountants do, because this is obviously his national accounts. And company accountants, let me compliment a little bit from what Paul was saying in his terrific lecture yesterday. Company accountants are very resistant to this intangible capital notion. I think in talking to them, and again, I'd be fascinated if others have had a similar experience, but in my limited experience of talking to them, they know that this intangible capital is very important, but they're resistant, maybe hasn't got a market, they're quite resistant to including it. So maybe we could talk about that later on. Okay. Overall labour productivity growth then is going to consist of a couple of things. Firstly, productivity growth within industries. So on a data set I'll tell you about in just a second, we've got 20 odd industries, and then the reallocation of hours between all those different industries. Now, of course, if you had more industries, you'd have different reallocation effects. But I want to then talk about two things. I want to talk about the reallocation issue, because that's an important policy issue. And then I want to talk about the labour productivity growth in the light of this expanded view about what is and isn't important. Now I'm going to do a bit of shameless marketing, so forgive me for this, which is this new data set, the CLEMS and the IntanProd data set, which I'm involved in with Cal Corrado, Cecilia Ioannilissina, Massimiliano Iomi, and Filippo Bontadini. Please go and download this data set. It's all available for free. It's an update of the CLEMS data, which Del Jorgensen was obviously very influential in, that Marcel Timmer and the group from Groningen has worked on as well. And what does it do? It brings in capital by asset, but includes the intangible capital, labour by skill, output and hours worked. We have 27 countries on the database, the EU countries, the US, Japan and the UK, roughly 40 industries, 23 industry aggregates, so far 1995 to 2020. There are various different modules depending upon what you want to do, but what we're trying to do here essentially is to integrate intangibles with all of this theory, so we expand the notion of output, and we recalculate all the rental rates and so forth. We would love to have Australia included in this as well. So happy to talk to people about how we can do this. We have a sort of technology essentially which pulls in the national accounts data, inputs the extra intangibles, re-engineers things, and then that's the data set. So as I say, please go to this website here and you can download it in state or R or whatever it is that you want to do. If I may say also, the students find this quite helpful as a sort of as an exercise for them to do. You can pick, the students can pick their favorite country and so forth. All right. Now, when we do the cross-country work run, let me say something about the reallocation issue. So as I mentioned, sorry, I'll just go back. As I mentioned, in these data here, we've got 40 industries, depending upon, we don't have 40 industries for everywhere, so normally we have around 20 industries. The reallocation issue, as I say, is the shifting from hours back and forth between these 20 industries. And I want to start then with the pandemic. And here's a graph that we made, this is in the International Productivity Monitor, and it is this. It is that the importance of that reallocation in labour productivity. And there are two things you can see on this, well, three things you can see on this. Firstly, because we've got lots of countries, we've split it up into the EU, centre, east, west, north, south. We've got the UK and the US. Secondly, this graph mostly hugs zero most of the time. And thirdly, and this is the point for this, in the pandemic, there's an enormous increase with all this. So this goes to 2020 when the data stops. In most of these countries, it's come right back down again. So we think that the pandemic, as it says up on the title of the slide, is very much a reallocation story. And again, talking about the UK, but I think this is the case for lots of other countries. In the UK, we basically closed down a large number of industries, in particular service sector industries, which are, at least in measured sense, low productivity, restaurants, places like that. And indeed, you see that in the data. You get a big increase in productivity. So that's the reallocation story. But the other issue, of course, was working from home, which became very important, which then raises the question, I think, about what capital we have available, what capital stock are we using. The conventional capital stock is workplace capital, but now that some people can work from home, Turns out we've probably got some more capital in the economy than we thought. Something which Jan Eberle, Paul Meisen and I call potential capital. That is to say, it was like in physics, it was there all the time, but we sort of didn't know it. And that's a combination of our house, which we can sit, well, again, not everybody, but those who can sit in and work at, and then the communications technology that we have there as well. And one way to get a sense of that is to do this. So this is across lots of different countries. This is between 2020 Q1 and 2020 Q2, so this is right at the heart of the pandemic, which is to take the official numbers of output change, which are in blue, and then go to the data and look at, for example, electricity consumption, which went right down when everybody was sent home, or Google mobility indices, which also went right down when everybody was sent home, and get that as a measure of the change in hours and multiply that by 2/3, which is what we normally do from a Cobb-Douglas point of view, and ask what would have been the output change if you did all of that. So if I take, forgive me, the UK just as an example, output would have gone down by 28%. Actually, output went down by 23%. So that gives you some sense of the working from home, in some sense, cushioned the bad blow from the pandemic. So I'm not saying the pandemic was a good thing, but it was one of the margins of adjustment. So I think when we think about productivity in the future, that's one of the issues that we might want to think about. Now, of course, you might say, oh, well, then why don't forget about all this intangible stuff that you've just been spending all this time on? But interestingly, I wonder whether working from home is a source of even more intangible investment for the follow. So here's some data, and then let me say what I think is behind this. So this is national accounts data here, again, from the OECD. Investment GDP ratios for software, R&D, and artistic originals, which are kind of a group of intangibles counted in the OECD. And you can see the big peaks there just around the pandemic, right? So again, what was going on there? I'm not sure there was too much R&D or artistic originals, but there was lots of software being invested in as people adapted to working from home. I say all that, maybe there were lots of artistic originals as well, right? Everybody's watching more movies at home. There seems to be a bit of a boom in the home entertainment industry. So you see a big blip up there. And then interestingly, in America, that's the blue line, and the blue dotted line is France. There's been a trend increase which has carried on, whereas in Europe, and well, I say in Europe, in the UK and France and Italy and Germany, there was a blip up, and then that seems to be static. So I think there's a fascinating question there about whether that's measurement or whether that signifies some quite important change, perhaps in America, perhaps in France. I guess my pet theory, I'm going to speculate wildly on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, is that I am struck when I go to the US how optimistic in the US they are about AI. To the extent that part of AI is software, other bits as well, but to the extent that part of it is software, maybe in America there's a lot of software investment going on, and they really are bringing this AI into the productive arena. And maybe in Europe we're not quite doing that. Okay, so that's some information about all of that. Now, under the heading of can we have some more restructuring, please, let me turn to the European policy debate. As Peter kind of mentioned, I've been involved in the sort of policy world, so let me just go away from the measurement for a second and say something about this. This is this gentleman on the left is Mario Draghi, with Ursula von der Leyen here. So this is a important report that Draghi just did just a few weeks ago on the future of European competitiveness. And this is an attempt to diagnose why it is that Europe seems to be lagging behind, in particular the US. Let me give you some quotes from this under the heading, as I say, of some restructuring has gone wrong. So the productivity gap between the EU and the US is explained by the tech sector. That's their opening line. At the root of Europe's weak position, it says the report, is a static industrial structure. Then it heaps full of praise for the US economy, redirecting resources towards sectors with high potential productivity. And in Europe, according to them, investment has remained concentrated in the low sectors. And then they call this the middle technology track. So this is a sort of long plea. There are hundreds of pages of all of this, partly using our data, but also using lots of the OECD data to essentially sort of talk about restructuring. A similar argument is going on in the UK at the moment, and here's a typical graph that you see. This is from a book by David Sainsbury called Windows of Opportunity. Here's some level productivity in 2016 of high-value services, £60 an hour, production, manufacturing in the middle, low-value services and agriculture. And these types of books Here's a typical conclusion. Countries with sectors with such levels of productivity should be deeply concerned about a decline in manufacturing, unless they're confident the employment will go into high productivity services and not low productivity services, which is again is a plea for something to do with restructuring. But of course, if all that's true, then there's a puzzle. Here's the same graph we saw a second ago, which is nothing seems to, aside from the pandemic, there just isn't much restructuring, or there isn't much contribution of productivity going on from this restructuring. So if it really were the case that these economies have got, that these economies have got this combination of very high productive and very low productive here, why is all of this contribution so low? And I think policymakers in the UK have struggled with all of this. So let me spend a minute on all of this. And again, I'd be very interested in whether this resonates with people in Australia or in other countries. So to develop this point, I can talk about what every Australian wants to hear about, which is of course cricket. So we start with cricket and the attractiveness of reallocation, which is the batting average effect. So as you know, in cricket you send your best batters in first, and then the other batters aren't quite so good. So your top batters are in the green there, the bottom batters are in the bottom there. So your top 6 batters, then the average is going to be the average of the green and the average of the red. And so the way to think about the reallocation effect is what people are hoping, I think, is that somehow if we could just have a few more top batters and substitute away from the tail enders, we could raise the average. And that's very much the spirit of this European report. Read tech sector for top batters and read low value, restaurants and things like that for lower batters. And again, if you look at that, you think, well, that's sort of fairly obvious. And then, but then again, it takes you back to the question of why this reallocation effect is so small. And I think this is where economists can be rather helpful, because maybe industries don't look like that. Maybe industries look a bit like this, which is the top batters there are pretty good, but the worst batter of all the top is about the same as the top batter of the second group. So you can see where I'm going here, which is I'm talking about marginal things. It is true on average that these green sectors are better than the red sectors. That kind of must be the case in cricket, it must be the case in industries. But at the margin, the question is, if we're going to make these changes, what's the marginal effect going to be? And if the industries look a bit more like this, then all we do when we make the change is we get rid of the worst, we get the top batter in the lower industries, we substitute them, but they are actually the worst batter in the higher industries. And of course, if that were true, then you would find that this reallocation effect is small. And in a competitive economy, so here's where I think a bit of economics helps these policymakers. In the competitive economy, something like the right-hand side picture must be true. If it were the left-hand side picture, then rates of return would be very high in the green industries. I'm going to swap between industries and batters, but you see where I'm going on this. Rates of return would be very high in the green industries, very low in the red industries, in which case we think that resources would move to the green and not to the red. So it must be something like the right-hand side here. So again, I think this is just a sort of theme where some helpful economics thinking will help illuminate the policy debate. One more thing on this, which I did do because I looked at this EU thing and was not all that fond of it, is I went to the CLEMS data, the CLEMS and TANinvest data that I was talking about, so there's a little bit of an advertisement for what you can do, and broke the industries into the following. So I've got the US and the EU9, and I've broken the economy, essentially the market sector economy, into the ICT using industries, the ICT manufacturing industries, and the ICT service industries. So what do I mean by this? So the ICT manufacturing industries are a subgroup of manufacturing, so they're making all this stuff. The ITC services industry is the communications and services industry, which is, Josh, help me out here, that's industry J, if I'm right, on all that, publishing and all that kind of thing. And I'm going to have everybody else's ICT using. Right? Now in the US, the ICT manufacturing industry is about 3%. In Europe, it's about 2%. The services industry is 10%, and in Europe, it's about 7%. So you might say, well, the Draghi report is onto something. Namely, in Europe, we've got a sort of industrial sector which isn't quite so concentrated in this ICT. And so what we can do then is we can take the labour productivity growth in all these different industries and shift the European shares to the American shares and see how well Europe is going to do. So that's a little bit of restructuring that you can do. And if you do all of that, you find that if you give the Europeans the US shares, European productivity goes from 1.25% to hardly any increase, 1.57%, right? And so you might wonder, well, why is that? Because surely we're shifting all of these European industries, we're giving them the characteristics of the American, more ICT intensive industries. And the answer, of course, is labor productivity growth within these industries is much higher in the American industries. So it's not enough just to shift the share. What you have to do is if you give them the US productivity, then you actually start to close the gap. So I think all of this sort of agonizing about the wrong share and the wrong share mix is a misunderstanding basically of this marginal average thing, but also perhaps a misreading of the data. I haven't seen them do a calculation like this. Maybe they did, and I just didn't see it. Also a misunderstanding about what the data is as well. And that takes us back, therefore, to understanding the within industry productivity, why it's high in the US and why it's low elsewhere. So I want to hop back then to understanding these within industry changes and the big changes in recent years. So a little review of all of this, again, taken from the Clems in TanInvest data. Just to get the right definitions on the table here, when it comes to the intangibles, here's a list of intangibles from Corrado, Holton, and Sickle. In the red box are those which are already included in the national accounts, because the national accountants are well ahead of the managerial and company accountants here. And they are software and databases, R&D, and artistic originals. We saw a graph of that just a second ago around the pandemic. The other CHS intangibles are things like design, branding, sort of business process systems, business process re-engineering, and employer-provided training, for which we use various surveys and so forth. So if you do all of that, what do you find? Tangible investment as a proportion of GVA has been falling for a lot of these countries. So you can see the line, I mean, there are too many lines there, but you can see the trend is going down. Intangible investment has been rising steeply for all these countries. So if you look at the last sort of cross-section, you can see that for every pound of tangible investment, or pound or euro or dollar, I should say, or yen of tangible investment, there's more being spent of intangible investment. So this intangible capital spending, if you include this expanded group, is more important than the tangible capital spending. One side note, which is to ask, well, if you've got this shift to more intangibles, can this help explain other things that we think has been going on in the economy? So I think the answer to that is yes. One is the leader-laggard productivity gap. So as I mentioned, the OECD have done this very influential work showing that the leading firms seem to have been breaking away from the laggard firms. So in conjunction with those people at the OECD, we've plotted the following graph, which is this. We go to the OECD microdata. They use Orbis microdata to work out the leading firms and the lagging firms. We break them into two parts. So we take the firms who are in the high intangible intensity industries. We take the firms who are in the low intangible intensive industries, and we calculate the gap that's been emerging over that period. And you can see from the dotted line, if you're in a low intangible intensive industry, there's not been much increase in the gap. It's gone up a little bit, but hardly at all. But there has been a big increase in the gap in the tangible intensive industries. And we think that that's got so two things. First of all, we think that the movement to intangibles helps then explain part of this leader-laggard gap. And secondly, what's the economic mechanism behind this? Intangible intensive companies, Microsoft, people like that who we saw earlier on that PwC ranking, probably have economies of scale and economies of scope over the kind of intangible investments that they are making. They're doing all sorts of intangible investment, lots of different projects. The projects spill over, you make other discoveries unrelated to the initial project because of the uncertainty of knowledge, and that all gives them a scale advantage. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is around markups. So here I'm going to be very unpopular with the markup literature and say there is no rise in the rates of return. And why do I say that? So again, here's another graph from our Journal of Economic Perspectives paper. So this is in the US. And what does this do? This, I'm sorry, these lines haven't come out very well. This higher line, the blue line here, which goes up a lot in the financial crisis and then keeps going up, is the Hall-Jorgensen rate of return that you get when you have no intangibles counted in your national account. So that is to say, it's the implied rate of return such that when you add everything up and do what Hall and Jorgensen taught us to do, what is the rate of return, the ex post rate of return that, as it were, clears the market and ensures that all the capital payments you're making are in line with labour payments and with value added. And you can see that that's been rising. This blue line, dark blue line here, is when you do exactly the same thing, but you put all the intangibles in and ask what is the implied rate of return there, and you can see that that's been flat. And so our view is that the observed increase in various different ways of estimating markups and all that kind of thing, which has been done in the US in particular, is an artifact of the fact that there were just many more intangibles around. And as we saw just a second ago, many of them are not measured. So the ones in the red box are measured. The ones outside the red box are not measured. So if you're trying to get some sort of return on capital employed, but you don't measure the capital employed, or you only partially measure the capital employed, then it's going to look like you're making a very high return. And again, we're not doing this company by company, but just to get some intuition, going back to the top companies, if you said, I'm going to measure the capital that, I don't know, Microsoft are using to try to get some measure of the return on their capital, the tangible capital that Microsoft are using would be, I don't know, the buildings and a few computers. Right? That's obviously just not, I would claim that is not an adequate representation of the type of capital that a company like that is using. They've got all the software capital. Apple have got all the software capital and the reputational capital and the ability to coordinate these supply chains and so on. So I think the intangibles work is kind of helpful, as I say, in understanding some of those issues as well. Okay, so if you do all of that, and then divide the data into the different periods, you get, I'm afraid, a rather messy graph like this. So let me try to say a word about what this graph shows. So what this graph shows, this is a growth accounting exercise where you take all the different industries, aggregate everybody up, add in all the intangibles, work out all the contributions and so on. So just to give you an idea of where this graph is coming. So let's take the EU9 to start with. Pre-financial crisis, productivity growth is going on at around just a bit over 1%, of which tangibles are contributing that amount, intangibles are almost the same as the tangibles, a little bit of labour, and the rest of it being TFP. Okay, so that's a pattern of all of these pictures. And you can do this by different industries and all that kind of thing. Now, I know this community spends lots of time at looking at pictures like this, and there are sort of too many colours on all of that. I think something that Carol Corrado has argued a lot, both to us and also to others, is when one is comparing pre-GFC and post-GFC, one has to be quite careful about the periods over which one compares. So between 2008, 2010, there's lots of negative TFP going on, for example. That's the yellow bit. There's even negative TFP going on in 2011, 2013 in the middle of the Euro crisis as well. And so if one wants to detect these more medium-term changes in TFP and capital and all that kind of thing, which probably are sort of much more medium-term, there's lots of mismeasurement going on, certainly over these big cyclical periods. It might be better to start pre-financial crisis and compare it probably not with the financial crisis years themselves, maybe even not with the immediate after years, but we've now got on the data 2014 to 2019, so we've got half a decade after that. And that's what this graph does, or more accurately, it compares the pre-financial crisis with the Euro crisis areas and the more recent period, 2014 to 2019. Now, of course, then we got the pandemic, but as we've seen, the pandemic has got its own peculiarity. So let me concentrate a little bit then on this part of the graph here as well and ask what's going on here. So this tells you something about the change in productivity growth pre-financial crisis to the most recent years. So the first thing is everything's negative, or most things are negative because everything's slowed down. Okay, so that makes sense. Let's start with the US, because everybody seems to start with the US. The contribution of TFP has gone down a bit, that's the yellow. The contribution of tangibles has gone down a lot, actually. So the US has seen quite a big slowdown in tangible investment. Intangible investment, if anything, is contributing more. So intangible investment seems to have held up in the US. And so that's pushed in the opposite direction. What about the EU? A similar decline in TFP, a similar tangible kind of effect, and then intangibles and labour are going the other way. And then lastly, I'm contractually obliged to say something about Britain. Big decline in TFP, and all these other things as well, with the exception of intangibles. But of course, this period here is the time of the Britain Brexit vote. We voted in 2016 to leave the EU, as you might know. So that was the shock that hit Britain then. So I try to summarize this on the right-hand side here. So what are these trends? I've written a slight TFP slowing. I mean, I shouldn't say a slight TFP slowing. The TFP slowing is maybe less than you would think if you looked at these earlier periods here, right, where there's quite a dramatic slowdown in TFP. So that's the first thing. Second thing is a slowdown in tangibles. And in the UK, as I say, there's probably a Brexit effect going on there as well. So that raises at least a couple of puzzles, which is, or a puzzle for us, at least on the intangible side, is you might say, but hold on a moment, how come all this intangible stuff has been growing, but TFP has been slowing down? Because if it's the case that some of these intangibles will have the property of spillovers, so if I invent something, then this is just a classic Grillicki's argument, that might spill over to Kevin and Rebecca and Erwin, they can invent things as well. If this intangible investment is going on, then you'd think TFP would hold up, right? Because all these spillovers are going on. Which leads one then to say, maybe there's more mismeasurement, maybe there's less spillovers going on as well. So the next few slides are to try to get at a framework which deals with all of that. I'll say one more thing about policy, and then Peter, if that's okay, I will then stop. The types of intangible capital is where we want to go, and this is picks up on some work that we did with Carol and Cecilia and everybody before the pandemic, actually, and didn't have time to complete. So this is trying to bring that back in again. So a word on this. So again, the Carotto-Holton-Sickle approach is to expand the amount of value added with all of this intangible capital. And there's a criticism, which I think is an important criticism, which Chuck Holton is very sensitive to, and it's right, which is that if you think of this intangible capital as being a business process, for example, then shifting the production function feels like the right thing. On the other hand, if you think of it being as something like branding, then the notion that it goes in the production function doesn't seem like the right thing. Surely it's shifting demand rather than the production function. So the question then is whether one could write down a model with different intangible capital types. I'm going to call R sub S as the knowledge input to production. So that's intangible input, which is going to affect the supply side of the economy. I'm going to call R sub D intangible capital, which is going to affect the demand side of the economy. So that might be branding. And then R sub A is going to be freely available spillover type capital as well. Okay. So let me just go through a bit of the algebra here. So apologies for all of these equations here, but they're all fairly similar. So the upstream sector is going to be producing supply side intangibles. So the extra output is going to come from the extra output of supply side intangibles with the various elasticities is going to come from labor of supply side intangibles working in those divisions of the plant, the capital and supply side intangibles, and then any knowledge. And then the demand side intangibles likewise are going to be produced from projects which are the labor working on demand side intangibles and capital and so forth. And then the production function, the final goods consumption is going to be produced from labor, from capital, and then this supply side intangibles here, and then all the various spillovers. So rather than all the intangibles going into the production function, just the supply side intangibles go into the production function. And so that gives the various elasticities and so forth here, which we're going to have a go at estimating in a minute. How do we deal on the demand side? Well, the way we deal with this on the demand side is to try to imagine the following. So suppose you've got, I don't know, perfume, and you've got branded perfume and unbranded perfume. One way to think about it is to say that, let's go over here. If you've got 10 bottles of branded perfume, that's equivalent to 20 bottles of unbranded perfume times some kind of quality adjustment. And the quality adjustment would be given by relative prices. Okay? And more generally, if we write down a demand curve where the demand for the perfume, the consumption good, depends upon the price and the demand shifting intangible capital, so think of this as being advertising capital, which shifts out the demand function, then the changes in the demand that you're going to get are from changes in price times the price elasticity in demand, and then the changes in the advertising spending, the intangible advertising spending, times the elasticity of demand, the elasticity of demand with respect to that intangible advertising spending. So that's the sort of shift out in the demand line. How are we going to sort of do all of this? So then the changes in the price then are going to be supported by changes in this intangible investment scaled by the various elasticities, demand elasticity, and the sensitivity of demand to all this intangible investment. And where that takes you is it takes you to the notion that if you're going to measure all of this consumption, then you've got the physical output, the changes in the physical output, and then the quality adjustment, which is endogenously caused by the intangible investment, times this theta parameter, which is going to be the extent of quality adjustment. If the statistical agency, if this is 1, the statistical agencies are doing a lot of quality adjustment, and so the measured is going to equal the physical and then the quality adjustment, just as we saw above. If it's a smaller number, there's going to be doing less quality adjustment. Where does that take you? That takes you to the following. So the output of the consumption goods, again, depends upon the intangible investments in the production function. The measured output depends upon the gap between the actual output and the amount of measurement that's going on times this is going to be intangible investment in demand. And it gives you an equation like this, which looks, so again, let me tell you what it is. So this is the measured output is going to be the elasticity with labor, the elasticity with tangible capital, the elasticity with intangible capital, that's what we've seen before. And then an elasticity with respect to intangible capital that shifts the demand function because of the various measurement issues that I've just said, and then everything else. So again, what does this do? The supply side intangibles are conventional, they have the elasticity. The demand side intangibles matter because they change quality and then they interact in proportion to the amount of quality adjustment that's going on. Go through all various more gyrations and so forth to do with all the various elasticities and all of that. And you end up with an estimating equation which says something like this. So let me try to focus on this thing here. So it says if we measure TFP and there's this intangible stuff going on and markups going on, all this, that, and the other, what do we get? The first thing we get is a fairly orthodox term, which is going to be if mu, the markup, is 1, this is going to disappear to 0. So this is from Hall's JPE paper in 1986, which said if there's imperfect competition, then TFP is going to be affected by the amount of inputs. Right? If there's perfect competition, then mu is 1 and there's no effect. So the solar residual is going to be affected by the amount of inputs, and he used an equation like this to try to back out an estimate of mu. So that's the first bit of it. The second bit of it is the intangible stuff. So where does the intangible stuff come in? To the extent that the intangibles is shifting the production function, then we're going to get an effect from the intangible intensity on capital, just as we had a labor on capital in the Hall approach, interacted by the various mismeasurement of shares that you've got going on if you don't quite know what the shares are and the degree of imperfect competition. So that mirrors the Hall kind of idea. And then what about R&D? What about intangibles on the demand side? They're going to come in, again, weighted by their various shares to the extent that there is quality adjustment going on. And then also the various shares, there's mismeasurement of shares because all this stuff has got to add up, plus all the various spillovers. I'm sorry to sort of go through all this fairly quickly, but just to give you some sense of this. So we ended up estimating on our data the following equation. So we're going to estimate TFP in all our different countries in the different industries over a period of time. On the conventional labor capital inputs, that's going to tell you something about the markup. On the supply side intangibles, which is going to tell you something about the mismeasurement of the various shares. On the demand side intangibles, which is going to tell you something about the degree to which the statistical authorities are measuring the quality, that's the theta. And then all these various outside terms, which tell you something about the spillovers. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this pre-financial crisis and post-financial crisis and see whether two coefficients have changed. Have the spillover coefficients changed? Right? Maybe there are less spillovers around. And has this coefficient here changed? And that gives you some sense about whether the measurement has changed. So when we do all of that, what do we find? So there are lots of different regression results, but here's a sort of representative specimen here, and it says the following. So this term here is the Hall term, so this gives you a markup of about 17%, right? 1.17 for the Lerner index. Here are the various effects of the external intangibles pre-financial crisis and post-financial crisis. And you can see the coefficient was 0.16, it's gone down to 0.12. So from a statistical point of view, these are probably not statistically significantly different, but some sense of a possible fall in these outside effects. And then here's the effect on the demand side, give you something about the measurement. The coefficient has gone from 1.6 to 0.3. That's a very robust finding, actually, suggesting that the degree of mismeasurement has just got worse over this period. And that degree of mismeasurement, of course, is endogenously caused by the fact that firms are spending more on the branding and the demand shifting intangibles. And if we can't measure those quite as well, then a more intangible intensive economy gives you more mismeasurement. And then we've got public sector R&D there as well. If you then do a decomposition of all of that, again, just to give you some sense of the numbers, you have an overall fall in TFP of about 0.28 percentage points, of which the mismeasurement contributes 0.16, which is a fair amount, and then the fall in the spillovers contributes about 0.7. So we think, I mean, this is just first set of regressions, we think there's something both in this extending the intangibles argument to this more broader set, and also something in understanding what these post-TFP, post-GFC productivity slowdowns are. I'll finish with one more question, which is a so what question, and this goes to the policy side. Suppose we've got all this faster productivity growth. We're presumably going to have some more GDP, but as Paul discussed yesterday in the environmental issues, is that really better living standards given the environment stuff? It's going to be helpful on the fiscal policy side for dealing with the deficit, which is a huge problem for the UK. And you might ask about what about inflation and monetary policy? And here the question is this: if we could discover more productivity, could we run the economy hotter? So this is the idea behind Sebastian Malenby's book. So if those of you who read this book, this is a book about Mr. Greenspan. Sebastian Malenby is a very distinguished British journalist for the FT, and it's a fantastic portrait entitled "The Man Who Knew." What did the man who knew know, according to Malenby? He knew that the output gap was y minus y star, usual notation. Inflation was alpha of y minus y star, and therefore, since he knew that there was more y star, couldn't you therefore, as the Federal Reserve, run the economy hotter? Now, as I say, Sebastian Malenby, I've had the privilege of meeting him at the bank one day. Very distinguished journalist, old-style journalist, proper investigative, not muckraker or anything like that. But it seems to me that he could have written a second book, and that second book, I think, could have been called The Woman Who Knew, and it could have featured this friend of the measurement community, namely our co-author, Cal Corrado, because there's lots of discussion in the book about who it was who Mr. Greenspan told to go and find out about all this Y-star stuff, and the answer was that it was Carol. Now, more slightly less personally, more on the economic side, just a word on whether we think about the logic of all of this. Under the heading of running the economy hotter meets Say's law. So there's a picture of Say there. And you might think about it in the following way. More productivity means more Y star. But it turns out in most forecasting models, again, I don't know the Australian situation, but in Europe and America, there's actually very little effect on inflation. In fact, in most forecasting models, Y rises to around Y star. In other words, in all these forecasting, or many of these forecasting, Say's law appears to hold. Now, if you're brought up like me on British economics, Say must be wrong. There's heaps of stuff in Keynes about saying how useless Say is. So, as I say, a schoolboy like me brought up on British economics knows that Say can't possibly be right, but it does seem to be in all these models. So what on earth is going on? And I think it's this, and Paul touched on this a little bit yesterday in his talk. A sustained rise in productivity, of course, is going to raise future income and wealth. Well, if you've got some forward-looking consumers around, they're trying to smooth consumption. That's the lesson of the Ramsey-style models and the Euler equations for consumption. And so consumption raises now. So what actually happens in these models is that when Y star goes up, Y just follows it. And that's why Say's law actually holds. So one way of thinking about this, so can you run an economy hot? Well, you could run it hot if it were all unexpected, or you had sufficient backward-looking or constrained consumers. I think that's the logic behind that. I've talked quite enough, but let me just say one more thing just quickly. We just set up a small DSGE model just to illustrate this with forward-looking consumers and a Taylor rule for monetary policy. An unanticipated TFP rise today in this very simple model means more Y star today, but everybody's surprised about that. So there's deflation. The central bank follows the Taylor rule and therefore lowers rates. And so this is the little model we've simulated here. The unanticipated rise in TFP is this dotted line here. Inflation goes down here, and therefore the policy rate goes down here because why central banks like us are following the policy rule. On the other hand, anticipated TFP tomorrow means more Y star tomorrow, but here's the crucial thing, it means more Y today. And Paul, you mentioned this a little bit as well. You've got these forward-looking consumers thinking about the future. Then if you say nothing about it, then you have low consumption. If you add in their consumption, I think you've got some rather large numbers. And so what happens there with more Y today is you actually get inflation because you get more, inflation goes up because it's taken time for the Y star to come along, in which case the central bank raises rates. So the situation in which you can run the economy hotter is very limited. Okay, so let me stop with just 2 more slides. So again, we looked at these various periods. There's a reallocation period here, fast intangibles, fast TFP growth beforehand, slow TFP growth, maybe less spillovers and worse measurement. And so I'm going to summarize then with what we've learned. So firstly, what I think has not happened is no enduring rise in reallocation, we think, and no rise in market power. I know that second is very controversial, but with the intangibles hat on, that's what I would say. What I think has happened, a tangible slowdown, not much of an intangible slowdown, but TFP has slowed down, so as I mentioned, maybe less spillovers, maybe worse measurement. Now we have to speculate wildly about what might happen in the future, and part of my job at the bank was to speculate wildly, so I'm going to do all of that. Further moves towards a more intangible economy, have to mention AI. So AI, of course, is a mix of software, which is intangible, running fast hardware, which is tangible, scanning databases, which are intangible, yet to be measured, but thanks to the efforts of Paul and other people in this room, will be measured soon in national accounts. I must say at Imperial, the scientists think there's going to be innovation in the innovation process. You speak to lots of scientists at Imperial, they'll tell you, so nuclear fusion is a good example, where we've been trying for decades to try to get nuclear fusion going. The scientists there talk about breakthroughs in software and artificial intelligence, being able to simulate these magnetic fields and so forth that the fusion people need in a way that couldn't be done before. Then TFP would pick up. On the other hand, proprietarial databases and all that kind of thing, fewer spillovers, TFP might fall. Could we get some innovation in what I call the hard to innovate sectors like health? Lots of discussion in the UK, and again, very interested in whether this resonates with other people about using new technology in more creative ways in these sectors where we've not been able to use them before. Working from home is a new business process. That's going to need tangibles and intangibles. That probably all takes some time. So measured productivity might fall. So I'm going to give you recklessly my forecast, which is that maybe I'm too invested in Imperial. I like the idea of there being a long-term rise in innovation. This feels right to me, but measured productivity seems to me might be the same or might slow. It's going to take a long time for the co-investments to come along for the measurement and all of that. We need some new policies and institutions for the intangible intensive economy around banking and raising finance and so forth, for all of that. And finally, a bit of good economics and a bit of good measurement I think will still be required, which is of course the purpose of this conference. So thank you again for listening to me and for Kevin and everybody for organising all of this, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. This was it's going to be
Very good talk. Thank you very much for it. Does the EU CLEMS database include land?
Good question, Owen, and no is the answer.
Isn't this a pretty big omission in this day and age?
I defer to colleagues who are better qualified than I. What we do, Owen, for right or wrong, I say we, this is Filippo has done all of this. He has some way of pulling from an API which pulls all the data from the various national accounts and then computes all the stuff that I've been saying. So to the extent that we rely upon the original national accounts data, if land is not in there, then we don't do it. Please, at the back.
Hi. I missed a part of at the beginning, so maybe you touched it at the beginning and I didn't, and I missed it. Well, first, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if there is any natural capital components that you are including in any of the equations, either in the tangible or intangible capital, since maybe not including that part of environmental degradation is actually not helping and calculating properly the productivity.
Yeah, thanks for the
Thank you.
question. Look, I'm very sympathetic to all of that. And again, I congratulate Paul on a terrific lecture yesterday from which I learnt a lot. No, that's not in all of this. The effort we've tried to put in, rightly or wrongly, is much more on the intangible side and then re-engineering rates of return to make sure that everything is consistent. Again, we'd love to talk to more countries who are interested in coming in to all of this. We have a technology which we think might help. But I think another stage of this whole investigation would be to bring in land and the environment and so forth. So all I can say is we'd love to do that too, but we've been focusing on the other stuff for the moment. Yeah, Carl.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's sort of in the measurement side of things. Obviously, the revision of the SNA has been happening over the last number of years, and one of the focuses has been digitalisation. You sort of were pointing at that. Sort of there was the slide with the red box of what's included in the national accounts. I'm just wondering about what two dimensions has the discussion that's been happening that you're aware of in the sort of national accounting space around capitalisation of digital assets. I know there was a decision not to include marketing assets, but obviously that was sort of part of the discussion. Where does that discussion need to go and keep heading? But also, what advice would you be giving to the statisticians in the room about what they should learn or what would be helpful from trying to keep on analysing in this space? What are the tips and tricks, or perhaps questions around asset lives, some of those more practical things that you might need to get to, aside from just measuring the expenditure, however well defined?
Yeah, thanks. Look, obviously we're very sympathetic to databases being measured as well. As I mentioned, when one talks about AI, there's, especially as I say, Imperial College, if you don't know, is a very sort of science and technology college. So there's lots of discussion about AI and everybody's understandably very excited about all of it. But to get some sight of it, from an economics point of view, I think this measurement approach is quite helpful. And as I say, the way I think about it is it's running very fast hardware, scanning software, running very good software, scanning databases. So it's across the tangibles and the intangibles, measured and unmeasured. So that's the way I think about it. So I'm obviously very sympathetic to the extent of bringing in databases as an intangible asset, but also, and that would help us have a sort of discussion about the AI. So that's one set of thoughts. The other set of thoughts is, we've been doing this work for a number of years in conjunction with colleagues at the ONS, many of whom are here. One of the things when we first started this is we just went out and talked to as many firms as we possibly could to try to get some sense of asset lives, some sense of how they sort of thought about all of these issues. And I'm sure my knowledge is out of date because we did a load of interviews with a guy called Tony Clayton, who's a friend of lots of people here, when he was very senior at the ONS. And there you got a strong sense that software was very important, branding was very important as well. But the asset lives of these intangible assets were pretty short, actually. So uniformly, people said to us, software just a few years, and then we've got to renew it. Now that takes one then to your question, which is for databases, we've got to decide how long the databases last. And then, of course, we've got to decide how to deflate them as well, which is not something you can ask firms. So I'm greatly in favor of going and talking to more firms about all of this. The other thing, of course, is to talk to colleagues in marketing, because colleagues in marketing are very interested in databases because they're often used in marketing, and there's lots of sophisticated analysis in marketing. I get quite a different view, actually. Lots of colleagues in marketing tell me that the value of databases is pretty small. And the example they always quote is an example I fear I'm not familiar with because I'm too old, which is Tinder, who started a dating website, my children tell me, which started from nothing. They had literally no data whatsoever, whereas all these other dating websites had lots of data, and they became the market leaders inside of a few months. And so that story, a lot of the marketing people tell as saying, actually, this data is not all that useful. It's not much of a barrier to entry, and you can get going very quickly, but then it doesn't last either, which of course might be then we don't have to capitalize it if it doesn't last for very long. But I admit that is somewhat of a, sorry, this is a rather rambling answer, but I think it's somewhat of a plea to both talk to firms and then talk to other disciplines as well, who I think could help us as a measurement community put some actual numbers on all this.
Just thank you, Jonathan, for a really interesting talk. Just a small sort of linkage back to one point I tried to make yesterday, which I think fits very nicely with what you just presented in terms of capitalizing consumer durables, because I mean, this is where you come to your point of working at home and using your own equipment, right?
Yes.
So in a sense, that's a capital stock unmeasured.
Yeah.
One of the reasons being that this is all expensed as a consumer, in the consumption, on the consumption side. So I think the points reinforce each other.
I think that's right, Paul, and maybe it's just very reminiscent of the age-old debate in GDP about what we do about home production. So, now people are working from home and we might want to measure that, but then people are washing up and looking after the children and all that kind of thing at home as always. We don't want to measure all of that. So we're then into that. Exactly. So we're then into that very tricky business. But it's similar conceptual issues with Uber and things like that, right? If I am an Uber driver and I use my car partly for business and then partly to take the children to school, how do we deal with all of that? I guess the answer is as we have more and more, flexible working, again, for the professions who can do it, then this issue becomes more and more salient.
A great talk, Jonathan. Really fascinating. I've got a number of questions. I'm still trying to choose which one to ask.
I'll write that.
Perhaps this. You spoke about reallocation.
Yeah.
And this is a very tempting idea that we have these different sectors. Some are high productivity growth, some are low productivity growth. Wouldn't it be better if we were doing more of the high productivity stuff and less of the low productivity stuff? A bit of a problem emerges here when you look at a country like Australia, because a low productivity growth sector in Australia is mining. So
low productivity growth.
Yes, high productivity level, but low productivity growth.
Yep.
So it's dragging Australia's productivity down. So should we stop mining? And therefore productivity growth would go up, and we'd have more income as a result. Well, no, it's not right. I mean, productivity growth can contribute to profitability, but some industries can have low productivity growth and still be enormously profitable. So just looking at reallocation and saying, well, that's the solution to the problem. We want to do less of the low productivity and more of the high productivity stuff, kind of misses the profitability of the relative profitability of the different sectors.
I mean, I think that's right, Kevin. And I think certainly in the UK debate, there's a horrible confusion about productivity levels versus productivity growth as well. So that makes things, I think, even worse. As I say, the puzzle to economists is why there's so little of this reallocation effect, at least in the data, although of course it could be within sector. And that's why I think thinking about these things on the margin is sort of helpful, which comes naturally to economists. It doesn't come so naturally to the productivity community because they're measuring average productivity all the time, not the marginal product. So having that conversation with people is quite difficult from a sort of public communication point of view. We used to worry about this at the bank enormously. But somehow or other, we've got to go down that route and find some compelling examples to talk about that.
Well, some of the service industries with low productivity are probably very profitable.
Yeah.
So you don't want to reallocate resources away from very profitable sectors.
Yeah, absolutely.
While I've got the microphone, perhaps I can just sneak in one other issue. So about these missing capitals. So you, with your Intan project, which is fabulous, by the way. I mean, I think it's a really great innovation and making all these data available freely. It's a wonderful public service that you and your team are doing. So if I understand correctly, now we've got some quibbles about what should be in there, what you're missing. But if I understand correctly, your attitude is, well, that's up to the national statistical offices to deal with those other types of capitals. We want, yes, it's a good thing if we take into account natural resource depletion and land and monetary balance holdings as well. It's another asset which is often missing from capital. But you're not going to deal with that. That's up to the National Statistical Office. Your bit is just adding these, specializing these other assets, these intangible assets. Is that your way of thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the way of thinking about it. And I mean, I hope, I know there are lots of people here from the stats agencies. I'm hopeful that this is a project working kind of with the stats agencies. We're not trying to replace what they're doing, so that the user can download these data, and if they don't particularly like all these intangibles, they can take them all out and go back to national account stuff. If they do like them, put them in. If they like some of them and they don't like others, they can do what they can do as they wish with them. So that's one thing. I'll say one more thing, if I may, Kevin, and thanks for kindly giving me the floor space. One of the other issues when one is doing cross-country comparisons, lots of people in the audience will know this, is of course different statistical agencies have got different procedures about, for example, computer deflators and software deflators and all that kind of thing. So we've put a lot of effort into trying to harmonize all these deflators. Now, Kevin, to your question, this takes us away from national accounts, of course, because if we harmonize deflator in country X with the US deflator, what it might be, then country X isn't using that for perfectly good reasons, then we're going away from that country X's national accounts. So this is another area where there's a bit of a deviation. But on the other hand, if one wants to do these cross-country comparisons, I mean, we've learned this from work at the OECD, one wants to do these cross-country comparisons, I think the harmonization thing is often a first-order kind of issue. So that's another angle on the data set. But as I say, I hope this is complementary to what the national accounts people are doing. Mike has got his hand.
Thank you. It was a great talk, so thank you so much. Can I speak up about market power? Actually, linking the point about so the TFP slowdown makes me sad, and it should make everyone sad. But if I think back to say when we were younger economists, right, and like internet comes along, and it was largely, it was free, essentially, it was open to be used. And if you think about how businesses operate today, and I think you pick it up there with, there's more intangibles, but there's less TFP. A lot more innovation is done, essentially, behind intellectual property rights. There's a lot more of that, clearly a lot more of that going out on, and to some extent, some of London's success in professional services is exactly locking that down. So to what extent do you think partly this is around that move to kind of put ideas behind the paywall is, as a deliberate business process, is hindering the spillover process? And then to what extent, and why are they doing that? Because it may well be that there's no rise in market power across the piece, but as your first slide showed, every single one of the big five there had tremendous market power, that we might be observing particular gatekeepers on the economy that are using their position to essentially extract quite a lot of rents from the system. And in so doing, stopping the kind of spillovers that we would have enjoyed in the 90s.
Thanks, Mike. I'm very sympathetic to that line of thinking. And I guess the answer is we don't quite know. On the one hand, if you say, I'm going to do all this intangible stuff, and then you reach for, as I say, that terrific Grillicke style literature, you'd think, well, there'd be tons more spillovers in that case. But this is a much more knowledge creation economy. There's lots of spillovers going on. We don't seem to have seen all of that. And I don't think we quite know, as I say, what it is that's inhibiting all of that. Maybe it's hiding behind the mismeasurement. There's more mismeasurement going on, and there's lots of spillovers going on. So that's the attempt to sort of draw this kind of framework. Again, I'm sympathetic to the notion that more data-based intangibles, data is more proprietorial than before. But then, as I was mentioning earlier on, some of the marketing people will tell you data's not all that important in any case. Look at some of these examples. So I'm honestly not quite sure we quite know the answer to all of that, which again suggests to me talking to firms is going to be helpful, and then finding out ways in which at least they think that these intangibles are the sort of moat behind which they can build their, their successful firms. Getting some sense from them, I think, is going to help us. Oh, Bert, yeah.
Thank you. Just one maybe simple or too simple question occurs to me when talking about productivity, comparing countries, etc. Where does in your whole setup the political and cultural conditions of the various countries come in?
There are lots of famous quotes from Solo, aren't there? You see productivity everywhere except in productivity statistics. You see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So Hebert, I think, has got a quote which illustrates this, which I've never been able to find, but lots of people say that it's true, which he says that every cross-country comparison of productivity always ends in a blaze of amateur sociology. And I think there's a lot in that, actually, because the other part of the productivity conversation, again, very interested if this resonates, with colleagues in other countries. The part of the conversation in the UK is around, well, the Germans work hard and the British are all very undisciplined and the Australians are all on the beach and all that, and all you have to pick whatever amateur sociological diagnosis that you've got. So I guess the strict economics answer is we sort of stick all that in the residual. To the extent we're interested in speed ups and slowdowns to a certain extent as well. So I find it hard to believe that culture changes so much over that. But maybe it goes back to Mike's question. Maybe the building of these intangibles, property rights and spillovers and all that have a legal aspect to them, but maybe they have a societal aspect to them as well around social norms, around respecting ill-defined property rights. So there's maybe something going on around all of that with these new types of intangible investments coming up and different sociological attitudes around all that stuff. But then that's amateur sociology. So I should stop at that point. We need to organize, Kevin, you need to organize a sociology conference in order for us to have a sophisticated discussion about all of this. But sorry,
I think I might need a break from conference organisation for a while. But could I just ask a quick question? Sorry, seeing as I have the microphone.
Yeah.
You had a regression results where you had a very low R squared. And so you were kind of trying to interpret the coefficients.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what's missing from the regression equations. And if you have any ideas what might be missing, and what you might need to include as control variables or that might get you a better fit.
Yeah, so I think this is a really tricky area. TFP growth is very noisy to start with. TFP levels are noisy, TFP growth is very noisy to start with. When we do the cross-country, cross-industry over time work, we're always putting industry, time and country dummies. Then we think funny things have happened over the financial crisis, so those are all interacted with dummies as well. And we still get a very low R squared to this. And I think what it takes you is there's lots of all this, I think, in the Angrist and Pischke book, which I know is a sort of Bible for microeconometrics and experiments and all that. But they've got some very thoughtful stuff about the extent to which if you throw in all of these dummies, how much of the variation do you actually dummy out? So for example, there's lots of variation in TFP growth across different industries, manufacturing versus mining, for example, as we just heard from Kevin. If you put in a dummy, you're dummying out that variation. And so all you're doing is you're exploiting the cross-industry kind of TFP accelerations. That's sort of even noisier somehow or other. So I don't think we quite know enough in interpreting these regressions about the extent to which we're just taking away a lot of the signal and injecting more noise. And I think that's all to do with what the R squared is and so on as well. Sorry.
Thanks. So thinking about the sort of time periods of comparison, sort of made the case pretty reasonably that right at the beginning of the GFC is a bad one, and then during the Eurozone maybe also bad, but then you're still in the zero interest rate phenomena phase after that. To what extent you think that that itself was affecting decisions around tangible investment, investor kind of sort of time horizon effects that would have been maybe killing off tangible investment there. And
Right, no, good question. So first of all, I'm contractually obliged to say that low interest rates were the result of wise decisions by the Bank of England over the last few years. So I have to tell you that. That there must be some kind of interaction between the low interest rates and the productivity. But of course, it could go in lots of different ways. If you look at these models of R star, the way they go is they say low productivity, for reasons we can't understand, has lowered R star, and therefore every central bank throughout the world has had to lower interest rates as well and got into difficulties around the zero lower bound. So there the causation is from low productivity to low interest rates. The other story around the zombies and all of that is low interest rates led to the entry and exit process, being impaired in some way, and low productivity. And we had a paper about that yesterday by Rebecca and others, which I think sort of speaks to that kind of issue. So I think we haven't quite untangled all of that yet.
We're almost running out of time, so I might, if you forgive me, selfishly end this with my own last question.
Oh yeah, Peter, yeah.
This goes back to your points on working from home and something that Paul also touched upon. So I think it's really nice to think about it, that working from home potentially unlocks a bit of the capital or part of the economy. But there's maybe already some signals that some other aspects of intangible production might be getting harder, the ones where you kind of need to interact with people. As we know, we're getting sick of Zoom calls with co-authors. So could you comment on whether you think there's some sort of trade-off going on with kind of an extensive margin and maybe the intensive margin of the innovation process?
I think that's a fascinating question, and one to which there may be an intangible style answer, which is as we get better software and better hardware and imaging gets better and all that kind of thing, then maybe the remote interaction can get better actually. So maybe there's a sort of technological answer to all of this. But in the end, I think it's back question to my answer to you, Bert, which is in the end, one ends up being an amateur sociologist here. I like meeting people and seeing people face to face. My kids are perfectly happy interacting up and down the screen, so maybe I'm just of a different generation, and maybe that's kind of the answer, that different generations are more adept at these different things and will adapt to them. But as I say, that's amateur sociology for you, so I shouldn't say anything more.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you.